Welcome to the Amphibian Press Podcast. I'm V.S. Holmes, and with me today is J.M. Landels. And just to give you a little glimpse of her work, this is the blurb for Alenia's song, Overture, which is the first in her series. You can't escape magic when it's in your blood. When Alenia was 7, she almost sang her baby brother to sleep. Forever. She may not be heir to her mother's titles and secrets, but she has inherited her grandmother's dangerous talent for singing music into magic. As her education proceeds from nursery to weapons ground to the rank of royal page, it becomes increasingly hard to keep her heritage and abilities hidden. Secrets, it seems, are stock in trade for her family, and as Alenia works to keep her own, she uncovers two that will affect both her life and the unstable peace of the Ilmar nations. One is the fate of her grandmother, who married a prince, turning the gift of sight into a double-edged weapon of state. The other is the truth behind her mother's 2-week disappearance, following an ambush by outlaws en route to her wedding. As she discovers who she is, Alenia must decide what to become. The skilled courtier her mother wants her to be, the political chess piece her father bargained on, or the hero her grandmother foresaw. Alenia's song, Overture, is a love story, a family saga, and a coming-of-age novel that braids together the stories of daughter, mother, and grandmother. This book is available on Amazon and also in paperback, so definitely grab a copy. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's always fun to get to know authors that you've sort of seen on the periphery and then hear a little bit more about the inspiration behind their work. So let's just dive in and tell me a little bit more about Alenia's song and the inspiration behind the series.
It started, it must be almost, well, not quite 20 years ago, but close to, probably 15 years ago. This character sort of came to me, sort of fully formed in my head, and I wanted to know how she got there. So she was, I ended up creating this character for a role-playing game, and played that for a little while, maybe a couple of years with her, but I just really wanted to know more about the character herself. And then I had this picture in my mind of this family portrait, and that's how the story opens, with the reader observing the family portrait of her and her baby brother, her mother, and her father. And it kind of just started from there. And I just started writing, and I knew where she was going to go. So I knew where she would be as an adult, and I knew where she was as a child, but I didn't know what happened in between. So that was the inspiration for the first book, which kind of takes us from the time she's a small girl up until the time that she runs away from home. And that's not much of a spoiler, that letting you know that she eventually runs away from home. It's everything that happens in between that's the interesting part of the book.
One thing I find fascinating is when authors actually play with their characters, literally, like you did with the role-playing game. That's something that I explored with one of my characters who I haven't written yet, but I had sort of an idea of her, and I was doing a role-playing game, tabletop role-playing, and I found you can get so much more into their heads when you're literally having to make decisions as them. You sort of said that you were playing with her before you really started to write her story, but do you feel like this is something you might do with future characters because of that insight?
Mainly because I don't have time to play RPGs anymore. and I haven't for years. It was, what I found was that, back when I was playing a lot of role-playing games, is that was a big creative outlet. My favorite part of a role-playing game was always creating the character, and then playing, that was good too. But I just always loved creating characters. And now that I'm doing that in fiction, I find I don't have the need, like I said, or the time, unfortunately, to continue doing that. But it was an interesting way to start. And I do have to say that the world that this story is set in is a shared world. It was Scott Fitzgerald Gray, who's another writer and editor, and he's an editor for Wizards of the Coast. And does other freelance Dungeons and Dragons stuff. So it's actually his world that I'm playing in. And I wanted to try as hard as possible to disguise the fact that the origin was in a role playing game. I'm very tired of the generic, quest adventures and things like that are so clearly D&D. So that was kind of, I really enjoyed that challenge of making what was already a wonderful role playing world into a fantasy storytelling world.
Now, do you have, because you have these two titles, Overture and Aria, do you have plans for another volume, or are you going to explore this aspect of that world a little bit more?
The third book in the trilogy is written, so it is written in very messy first draft at the moment, and that's what I'm doing now, is putting that together to create the final book in the trilogy. So it will stop there. There's a little short story that's outside of the novels that's been published in pulp literature, and it's a short story about her grandmother. I probably won't do much more exploring in the world after that, because I have a historical series based in 17th century France about a shepherdess turned spy that I'm kind of diving into now. So that's where I am with my first draft work. Although you never know, like once the 3 are out, I may go back in there and play around a bit.
I always end up being unable to leave a world fully. I mean, most of my work starts out as like a standalone, and then 12 books later. But I always love exploring the side characters that we meet sort of along the way, and I can't just let their stories go.
Well, my book is actually 3 characters. There are 3 main characters in the whole series. The other 2 characters are Elenia's mother, Larissa, and her grandmother, Idane. And their stories are told side by side when they're both younger women. So Larissa's story is the story of how she was sent off to marry a duke in a foreign country, and her caravan gets ambushed on the way, and that's what happens to her. So her story takes about 2 weeks and is sort of interspersed with Elenia's story. And then Irdane, her grandmother, she was sort of a traveler character, like a gypsy type character. And so she's from a nomadic people. She fell in love with Prince, ended up marrying him, ended up having to be divorced for various political reasons. But she's a master manipulator. She has the gift of the sight, so she can see events before they happen, not always in a logical order. So she's always got her fingers in the pot. She's always trying to shape events. And so her story is also told at the same time. And they kind of weave together till you get to the end of the trilogy is actually where all the timelines finally meet. So they're happening at different places at different times, and I tell them in different tenses and points of view. So I tell Larissa's story in third person present. I tell her Irdane's story in first person present, and I tell Elenia's in the traditional first person past.
It's always interesting when there's multiple points of view over a different timeline, because I write multiple points of view myself, but I haven't yet tried to do something out of chronological order, I guess. And that sounds really fun, but also really complicated. Was that difficult for you in your process?
The process itself was not difficult. The editing to put it together for publication was the most difficult. Because I write the 3 stories separately. I may write them, I may take turns. I may write one week and then another the other week. But I write each character's arc from beginning to end. And then I sort of have to slice it up chronologically. With the first book, that came together beautifully. It was hardly any effort at all when I started interweaving them. It was like, it made all these beautiful connections that I hadn't even planned, and they were wonderful segues, even though we were at different times. And then the second book nearly killed me. It was because I'd got so deep into it that I had lost some of the timelines, and I had to go back and figure out the timelines and make sure they were working when I put it back together.
So, speaking of someone who has their fingers in a lot of pot, like your character, just reading your bio, you sound like a fantasy character in and of yourself. You have a lot of different things going on, which I find really fascinating. How has your work, sort of outside of writing and literature field, informed your writing? Because I mean, you're a dueler, you're an equestrian, you're a sword fighter, so I can see all of those things really impacting your fiction, especially with this story.
Oh, I mean, it's huge. I mean, my work as a doula and childbirth educator really shows up in Alenia's song because one of the main characters is a midwife, and it's really a story about mothers and daughters. So there's a lot of birth and babies and things like that. I actually started sword fighting when I was doing research, and that was for my 17th century series. And this was this was over a decade ago, probably 12 years ago. I was looking up 17th century rapier, and I found there was a sword fighting school in Vancouver, and it's like, they teach this. I can go and do this for real. So I started down that path, and I've been doing that ever since. It may have taken away from my writing a little bit, but I think it's contributed a lot to it. It certainly made my sword fighting scenes a lot better, and my knowledge of weaponry in general. And then the horse stuff. Well, I've been riding horses all my life. I run a barn. Horses will always play a fairly big role in my fiction, which is probably why I write fantasy and historical, because that's the only place you can really fit them in.
Yeah, with the exception of a western or something. I always think it's interesting seeing how people's daily lives get woven into their writing. And as soon as I saw the horse thing, because I've ridden since I was little as well, but sort of on the western aspect of things, more like trail riding and cowboy stuff. So it's always neat to see that. So tell me a little bit about your work with Cavalier, which is mounted combat, and I just think that is so fascinating. And what sort of things, as sort of an expert, so to speak, with sword fighting and mounted combat, what things do you see in movies or in books that are just like make you cringe as far as mistakes?
Oh, where to start? There's so much. Well, one of the things you see in movies is you'll see huge Shire Clydesdale horses, these big draft horses used as knights' mounts. Historically, they weren't that big. For those of you who know horses, about 15 hands was the height of an average war horse. So that's maybe a little bigger than your generic quarter horse, but definitely smaller than a thoroughbred, definitely smaller than a Clydesdale. So they weren't tall horses. They were very round horses. And they were the sort of Baroque breeds like the Andalusians, Frisians. Well, not Frisians so much. They were a bit tall and they were draft horses. But the generally sort of more compact and curvy breeds. So in our mounted combat program, the first horses we bought were Canadians. And that's sort of the kind of horse we were looking for, because they're very similar historically to what people rode from the Middle Ages up through the Renaissance. Other things you'll notice in writing is just, we've done a whole panel of this. I do a presentation. Well, Creative Ink Festival was canceled this year, so I won't be doing it this year, but I've done it before. And I did a panel that Sarah Pensker, the author, came up with the title with, was A Horse is Not a Subcompact. And it's just the way characters tend to just ride their horse and just forget about them. You can't just park a horse the way you park a car or a motorcycle. You have to actually deal with the horse. So those are the things I see most often, is people just not considering that you are traveling with a living, breathing creature that needs to eat, that needs to defecate, that needs rest, and that will run away if you don't secure it somewhere. So those are kind of things I always try to point out when I'm doing these panels and lectures.
I'm always astounded when people also travel in a very quick manner with horses because they tire easily, and traveling, especially in fantasy novels, it's always these like epic journeys. And if you're not exhausting your horse, then you need to address, how you're not exhausting your horse and that you're switching mounts, and or if you are exhausting the animal, like what the ramifications of that are.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you need to you can a horse travels about the same speed as a human when it's walking. It can walk 3 to 5 miles an hour. So if you're going any faster than that, then you are pushing your horse. If you're trotting, if you're cantering, which you see in movies all the time, or galloping, a horse can't sustain that for a long time. They can go a long time trotting. They can go a long time walking. But if your horse gets dehydrated, exhausted, collapses, then you're without a mount.
Tell me a little bit about, sort of switching gears here, your work with the Pulp Lit magazine, because I think that that's really neat. And I love how authors always have these little side things that we do, because I think as creative people, we always have to have something going on that we're working on. So tell me a little bit about how Pulp got started and just your work with it in general.
Well, it got started in 2013 when my writing partners, Mel Anastasiou, Susan Peters, and I were sitting on the deck of Mel's house in Bowen Island, drinking beer. That was probably the first mistake right there. And we just decided, we thought, well, we know a lot of authors. We know a lot of people that write, that want to get published. We know mainstream, well published authors that want to write outside of their usual genre. Why don't we put a magazine together? So, right on the spot, we came up with the idea of doing a Kickstarter, which we ran in the fall of 2013. We raised enough money to produce the first issue of the magazine, and that went so well, we decided to keep going with it. We ran a couple of Kickstarters, well, probably 3 or 4 after that, and that each year. And then we stopped doing the Kickstarters because it's so exhausting to run one. And the magazine's, it's more or less self-sustaining now. It's not like it pays us anything. Most of our work is still volunteer as editors, but we do manage to pay writers and artists and provide a venue for short fiction in the Canadian market, which is pretty rare.
I mean, obviously, you work a little bit with short fiction. Do you find that your voice changes, your writer's voice changes from short fiction to your longer fantasy epics or your historical fiction?
Ironically, I do not write short fiction much. I've done a couple of short stories, but they are all parts of larger milieus. I love short fiction. I admire people who can write short fiction, and the shorter the better. I mean, I find that flash fiction is gorgeous when it's done properly. It's just not something. It's not something I am very good at, but I find that I am good at editing it. So I love getting a story that's almost there, and helping the author just tighten it up and make it punchier and shinier, and turning that sort of idea into something that just sparkles.
I'm always amazed at the authors who rebel or get a little balked by editors. And I mean, obviously, there are good editors and bad editors, but every time I get a piece back from an editor after that initial, like, oh God, my baby, thing, that I think probably we all have a little bit of a twinge when we see those red pens. But I get so excited because I know that editor is bringing to life what I was really trying to say, and just honing it to something that is what I meant to say, but maybe I didn't actually quite get to. So So tell me a little bit about what's next for you, because obviously Aria releases in April, um, and that's really exciting. But also, what are you doing this year? I mean, other than quarantining.
Well, we're still deciding whether or not we'll be able to have a physical book launch for Area. We were planning one for April 19th. We haven't canceled that yet, but we'll see what happens as things progress. And unfortunately, yeah, a lot of the places that I was planning to go and launch it have, conventions and things have shut down. Um, but whenever things sort of get back to normal and we can have public gatherings again, we'll just launch it then. Other than that, keeping on with the magazine, I'm mainly concerned with getting edits done on the third book so that I can publish it next year. I made my readers wait a long time. I published Alania in 2017 and promised everybody it would be out in 2019, but our press also releases other people's novels, so I ended up spending a lot of time on three other amazing novels. One was the sequel to Stella Ryman and the Fairmount Manor Mysteries. It was The Labors of Mrs. Stella Ryman. We released that last year. We released Advent by a debut author who happens to be Alice Munro's nephew, Michael Kamakana. And so that took up the early part of the year. And then we were really honored to have been given Matthew Hughes' magnum opus. It's basically his life's work. It's the one he wants to be remembered by, and that's What the Wind Brings. It's amazing historical epic with slipstream elements. And that did take up a lot of my time, so that's my excuse for not getting Area out last year. So I'm going to work really hard to try and get the final book, Corral, out in 2021. And we have another novel by Mel Anastasiou coming up, and we have some other authors in the works that I'm not at liberty to talk about yet. But on top of the quarterly magazine, we try to do 2 or 3 novels a year if we can.
I was also late by like 2 years with my upcoming release, and it's just stuff sort of gets away with you. I feel like that happens a lot with fantasy novels, and I just have to keep telling myself, well, I'm not George R. R. Martin and I'm not Patrick Rothfuss, so at least I know that the book is going to be out at some point and not just disappear into the ether, and my readers will have something to look forward to eventually. But tell me where my listeners can find you online, and if they're not able to breach the quarantine to come see you in person.
Well, pulpliterature.com is the website, and I have my own website as well, which is JM Landels. So you can search that. You can also find the books are on Amazon. Alania's Song Overture is on sale for 99 cents right now for the ebook, and the paperback has been discounted, which is entirely out of our control, but Amazon has kindly discounted it to about half price. So if you want to grab it for, I think, $8 or something like that, you can get the paperback. And Area is available as pre-order on Amazon as well, and on the Pulp Literature website. So you can pre-order that and be one of the first ones to get that too.
Awesome. And we'll be sure to put all the links in the description so people can just click on them and find you. But thank you so much for joining me today. And it's just, I really love talking to you, and I love speaking about the different details of swordsmanship and horses in fantasy worlds.
Oh, my pleasure. It's nice to chat with you, and I always love to talk about horses and swords, and I could go all day, but my vet is coming soon, so got to go out and hold horses for her.
Well, best of luck with that. I hope everything goes smoothly for both of you, and the horse, of course. This has been the Amphibian Press Podcast, and with me today was J.M. Landels. Thank you so much for listening.